Some of you might know, my wife most certainly knows, that one of my little quirks is I jot down sayings, of what famous people say and what people we don't know say as well. They're little snippets that allows me to kind of focus in just a few words on something that I might need to kind of like move me along in life. And so I'm not going to read you my whole list. There's like over 150 of them right now.
Good.
I'm going to read her my whole list, but that's later on. One of them that I have that just drives her crazy, and you've heard me say this before, is when it's your time, it's your time. And even though that sounds aggravating and depressing, it can't be disputed. There is a time, for all of us and what our life is going to be. Another one that I have jotted down is hear what they say, but watch what they do. Sometimes that's a big contradiction in life. Now, a couple others, what Robert Frost has one here. I just saw this one the other day. The best way out is always through, which gives us an insight in terms of perseverance and kind of keep going, when sometimes we want to give up in life. A couple here that I don't really know who said these, but I've jotted them down too. It's one says, it's never too late to start, but it's always too late to wait. And the shadow proves the sunshine. Now, all these are indisputable when you think about them. They're short little snippets, but it gives you a perspective on life. And maybe sometimes you might need a little lift here when there's darkness around and all that. This one says that the shadow proves that there is sunshine. You know, this one though has become one of my favorites. It occurred in January right here on this Zoom thing. When we started the new year, Brother Tony had spoken in one of the messages that he gave us, and he kind of put a thing out there for us. Said, "Let us strive to thrive in 25." Right?
Yep.
Now this is July. Half the year is done. How are you striving, folks? You know. Again, a short little snippet, but it makes you kind of stop and think a little bit about where I'm at. The point of what I'm going to speak about today is one that Ben Franklin did in the 1700s. And my granddaughter put a little coaster together when she was doing her crafts one day. I've got it upstairs by the table. And that one says, there's a place for everything, and everything has its place. Now you think about that for a bit. That's a principle of order. Uh, it's the thing of intentional living. It gives us spiritual insight. And I'm going to think that before Ben Franklin said that, I think that was in God's vocabulary for us to understand. There's a place for everything, and everything has its place, reflects the nature of God in our life. And it gives us order. It gives us a point of intentional living, and it tells us that it's got spiritual insight, reflecting the nature of God in our life. He creates. God organizes. He creates a purpose for all things in our life. Think about that. That our God is a God of order, not chaos. Corinthians, Paul noticed it in Corinthians. He wrote here, he says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace." And you got to go back to the beginning of creation. Go back to Genesis. Go back when the world was being formed and there was nothing of any shape or conformity or anything at all. And God took it upon himself at the beginning of creation to create order out of chaos. He separated and he created light from darkness, sky from the sea. He made land from water. He formed what we know as our world today. Every part of creation is placed exactly where God wanted it to be. He's a God of order. And so, when life feels chaotic, kind of out of sync or out of place sometimes, um, and that happens to us a lot, you know, uh, in different ways or shapes or form, we got to think a little bit about maybe there's a place for everything and everything has its place. Maybe in our juxtaposition of us and God, maybe we're out of alignment a little bit with what God's order is in our life. And I think, again, God has an intended order for our lives as much as anything, more so than what we can even understand and figure out sometimes, because we've got our agendas, right? We got places to go, things to do, responsibilities like little people, and things like that. We've got doctor's appointments we got to deal with, and all these other stuff that's going on in life here. And that gets so overwhelming in our life that we can get out of whack with what God's intended order is for our life. Solomon, I believe, wrote Ecclesiastics, and third chapter of Ecclesiastes, there's something there that talks about order in a way. He says in that scripture, it says, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. That's order. And he goes on to say, just after that, there's 28 conditions of life that we all experience. And we're in some way, shape, or form involved with many of these things right now. And if we're not today, well, we will this week. Talks about there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up, a time to kill, a time to heal, goes on, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, he says. A time to embrace, there's a time to refrain from embracing. There's a time to get, there's a time to lose, there's a time to keep, there's a time to cast away, there's a time to rend, there's a time to sow, there's a time to keep silent, there's a time to speak, there's a time to love, there's a time to hate, there's a time of war, and there's a time of peace. 28 conditions of things that consume us and kind of lose track of order in our life. And without what we just did here this morning, focused on God to help us through all of these conditions in life, it begins to put order in our life, which would be uncontrollable any other way. Look around us. Look at the news. Look at what's going on in the world there. God's not in the midst of a lot of people and what they're doing. There's chaos there. They're out of order in terms of what God's expectation and plans are. God not only places us where he wants us to be, but he also is out there telling us where we should be and even what we should be doing somewhat. And as every one of us has a purpose under heaven to do our duty to the Lord. Just as we had here, there's all of us on this Zoom thing in 8, 9 different places in the country and Canada. And we were on the same page here just a moment ago, but we're all different. We look around and none of us are the same. We've all got different agendas and we've all got different histories and we've all got different purposes and responsibilities in life. Paul again notices that, and he says, in terms of, I think about this in the order of what God expects from us. He says in the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians, he says that there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. That same Spirit means that God created us to be different, but there's an order to his presence in our life. There are differences of administrations, he said, but it's the same Lord that we serve. There are diversities of operations, but it's the same God which worketh us in it all. body has many parts, many functions, as another example, all for a singular purpose. Our bodies come together for a singular purpose. But just like it is, the eye isn't created to hear, and the ear shouldn't be trying to walk, because that's not an order of things. We need to fill the roles that God has ordained for us to do. And we have to keep asking that question: where's my place, Lord? What do you want me to do? How do I get within your order in my life? We watched a movie last night called What Would Jesus Do? And it was about this town somewhere in California. It was a fictional town, but they were having some struggles in their community, and there was just a lot of chaos and a lot of discontent and a lot of this trouble. And this drifter walks in the town, and that drifter really was Jesus. And he starts to come. He was looking for a job. He wanted to find a purpose to help in this town, and everybody ignored him because they had their own agenda, and they couldn't see or realize who he was, and everybody just cast this guy aside until it culminated to a point where it was overwhelming for the town. And they all began to realize that, this drifter was an individual that was there to bring order to their individual lives. And when that order in their individual lives came together, that community came together. And it was successful, not because of themselves, because they I think realized that this stranger that was walking around town was Jesus, and they put themselves in a perspective in the situations that they saw in their lives, rather than think about what they would do. They aligned themselves to what Jesus would do, and that changed their perspective 100%. Where unity came together as a result of that, and that was an interesting presentation, I think, about how easily, as we forget the fact that it's the same God that we serve that's created the diversity in all of us, but we got to hold fast to the fact that He's got to be the center of our life, and that we need to kind of bring the order that God ordains into our daily lives in such a way that it's automatic, that we don't have to force ourselves to think about that. In our homes, in our families, in our ministries, we've got to be diligent. We've got to be focused. We've got to kind of start paying attention to who we are in relationship to God's plan in the world, but more specifically in our life. And that's what happened to these people in this town. They were all individuals, if you will, but they had to come together, because of what God wanted them to do in that community, to bring peace and understanding and joy back into their lives. Our old friend King Benjamin and Mosiah had something to say about this too, if you recall, in the 4th chapter of Mosiah. It says, he says, and see that all these things are done in wisdom and order, he says, for it's not requisite that a man should run faster than he has strength. And again, it is expedient that he should be diligent, that he might win the prize. Therefore, all things must be done in order. We've got to get organized in our own lives, And this is not just good advice. I mean, this is divine instruction, that will allow us to lead an ordered life that God ordains us to have. So, question we've got here is your life cluttered? Do we have physical turmoil? Is it emotionally disruptive? Are we spiritually torn in some situations? Maybe God's calling you to reorder some things in your life. Maybe what He's saying is, clear the noise and the distractions. And the church has had many experiences over the years about distractions that take us away from Him being the center of our life into other things that consume us, that kind of have us going in all different ways in life. We need to make some space for the Lord in our life, and then we set out to do what we think we need to do, because He'll give us the direction, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. Acknowledge Him in all your ways, and He will direct your path. That's centering. That's focusing the Lord in our life. Not taking charge of our own destiny, but just kind of relinquishing ourselves to Him to put things in its place in our life. There's a place for everything, and everything has its place. There's a place for God in our life, first and foremost, and then everything else will come into order in our life. Somebody said in their prayer about the peace of Jesus, and there's a lot to that in terms of putting things in its proper place. A couple of weeks ago, Brother Tony had done a presentation for us and a message, and he had a slide up there, if you recall, right? It was a town in Central Coast, California. Remember the name of that town? I think there was 18 people that lived there. It was called Harmony. Harmony. We're not in harmony if we have this turmoil in our life. I wonder if the people in Harmony have harmony. You ever think about that? Tony, you need to check that out next time you go there. Take a poll. But I wonder about that. I mean, harmony. That's aligning ourselves with God in our life first. We need to be harmonious with God. Because God has given us Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, has walked this earth in like we have. He's seen it all. He's experienced it all. And what He was trying to tell everybody then, that continues for 2,000 years to today, is that He offers us peace if we're centered on Him. In John, Jesus Himself says, "Peace I leave unto you," He says. "My peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth," He says, "give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." And that only happens when we center ourselves on God in Jesus Christ. That's when peace comes in our life. And it's not from external circumstances. It's not from anything, in spite of what we might think, anything that we do. Peace comes in our lives because we know the Savior. And we give ourselves to Him to lead, guide, and direct us in all that we have to do. But oftentimes we get busy. We're involved with all those 28 conditions of life that Ecclesiastes talks about, that kind of takes us off in tangents, and we lose the place of God in our life. So, a place for everything, and everything has its place. That's more than a proverb or a witty saying. It's a reflection of God's divine design. And we got to acknowledge God's order in our life. And we've got to accept our place in what His plan is. And we got to walk in His peace, in His purpose, and His power. So, I got 3 questions. Kind of contemplate maybe this week for yourself. Are you living in God's order? Are you walking in the role that God's designed for you to do? Are there any areas of your life that need to be put back into their proper place? So maybe we can change that saying that says there's a place for everything and everything has its place. And maybe we can say something like, there's a place for God in me. And God has a place in me. Affirmatively saying that and living it that way. Kind of like the "what would Jesus do" philosophy. We got to put it out there and we got to live it. And got to reorder our lives sometimes to say, okay, I'm out of sync with the Lord's ways. I've got to bring myself back in. That's what I think Sundays are for. It's the readjustment time. You know, because from Monday through Saturday, there's a whole lot of life that goes on that can pull us and tear us and take us in different directions. And by the end of the week, if we don't have a Sunday to kind of regroup again, to put a place for God in our life so we can deal with it next week again, we'll be nowhere. We're going to be lost, like the world is today. The world needs to get God in place and calm down. You know, probably not going to happen. So you know what we got to do? We got to get ourselves prepared. You know, we need to be a little selfish in this regard, and take that priority that we need to have with God being first in my life, with Jesus being the person that walked for 3.5 years or so and walked the talk, walked our life in such a way that there's nothing that he didn't come across that we don't go across today in our life. But you know what? He had the proper order of things, you know? So by the end of his life, on this earth, you know, he had the Father's perspective, right? Remember, you know, he said, Lord, you know, you can let this cup pass from me. You know, I really now, you know, I'm not comfortable with where I got to go. But he came to himself like that prodigal son, and noticed that the proper order of things is that God the Father takes charge. And even Jesus succumbed to that. So there's the example that we've got. There's a place for everything, and everything has its place, and that's God has its place in our life and whatever we may do. We want to do the recording, and unless anybody wants to say anything, but we'll turn over testimony.